He opened the locket and found a photo of a young woman inside. Her eyes seemed to stare right through him. He felt a chill run down his spine. Jake slipped the locket into his pocket and hurried back to the security office. As he sat at the desk, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. He pulled out the locket and examined it again. The woman in the photo looked familiar, but he couldn't place her. He decided to look through the old records in the office, hoping to find some information about her. After an hour of searching, he found an old newspaper clipping. It was about a patient named Emily Hart, who had gone missing from the asylum years ago. The photo in the article matched the one in the locket. According to the article, Emily had been a patient at Whispering Pines for several years. She was committed after a nervous breakdown, and her condition had only worsened over time. One night, she vanished from her room, and despite an extensive search, she was never found. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked around the security office, half expecting to see Emily's ghost watching him. He shook his head, trying to dispel the fear. It was just a story, he told himself. There was no such thing as ghosts. But the night was far from over. Around 3 a.m., the monitors flickered, and the lights in the office went out. Jake cursed under his breath and grabbed his flashlight. He stepped out into the hallway, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He made his way to the electrical room, hoping to fix the problem. As he walked, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. He reached the electrical room and opened the door. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust. Jake shone his flashlight around the room, looking for the breaker box. As he moved deeper into the room, the door slammed shut behind him. Jake jumped and turned around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. He tried the door, but it was locked. Panic set in. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, but his voice echoed back at him. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Jake's heart raced. He fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. The darkness seemed to press in on him, suffocating him. Then he heard it. The soft whispering again, growing louder. "Help me." Jake felt a cold hand brush against his arm. He screamed and stumbled back, falling to the floor. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Help me, please." Jake scrambled to his feet and pounded on the door again. It swung open and he fell out into the hallway. He didn't look back. He ran down the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the security office and slammed the door behind him, locking it. He sat at the desk, trying to calm his racing heart. The monitors were still out, but the emergency lights had come on, casting an eerie glow in the office. He pulled out the locket and stared at the photo of Emily. What had happened to her? And why was she haunting this place? As the hours ticked by, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The whispering continued, sometimes faint, sometimes loud. He felt like he was losing his mind. Just before dawn, he heard a loud crash from the basement. He grabbed his flashlight and reluctantly made his way downstairs. The basement was a labyrinth of old rooms and storage areas. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of mold was overpowering. He followed the sound to a large iron door at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was ajar, and he could see a faint light coming from inside. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. It was an old operating room, long abandoned. Rusted surgical tools lay scattered on the floor, and the walls were stained with dark, dried blood. In the center of the room was an old operating table, and on it lay a figure covered in a white sheet. Jake approached the table cautiously. He reached out and pulled back the sheet. Underneath was the skeletal remains of a woman, still wearing a hospital gown. Around her neck was a silver locket, identical to the one Jake had found. He opened the locket and found a photo of the same woman, Emily Hart. Her hollow eyes seemed to stare right through him. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room grew cold. The whispering returned, louder and more urgent than ever. "Help me! Help me!" Jake backed away from the table, his flashlight flickering. The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. He turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The whispering grew louder, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. "Help me, please." Jake felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The cold hand tightened its grip, and he felt a searing pain in his chest. The last thing Jake saw before he blacked out was Emily's skeletal face, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. When Jake didn't show up for work the next day, his boss sent someone to check on him. They found the security office empty, the monitors flickering with static. They searched the building, but there was no sign of Jake. The police were called, and a thorough search was conducted. In the basement, they found the old operating room and the skeletal remains of a woman on the table. But there was no sign of Jake. The building was sealed off, and the developer abandoned his plans to convert it into apartments. The old Whispering Pines Mental Asylum was left to rot, a dark reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. To this day, the building stands empty, and locals avoid it, saying it's haunted by the ghost of Emily Hart. And some say that if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear the faint whispering of a young woman begging for help. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might see the ghostly figure of a security guard, forever trapped in the darkness, searching for a way out. The legend of Whispering Pines Mental Asylum grew over the years. People in the nearby town whispered stories of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions. Despite the warnings, the allure of the haunted asylum attracted thrill seekers and paranormal investigators, all eager to uncover its dark secrets. Among them was Lisa, a young journalist looking to make a name for herself. She had heard the stories and was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Equipped with a camera, a flashlight, and a voice recorder, she planned to spend the night in the asylum and document her experiences. Lisa arrived at the asylum just before sunset. The building loomed before her, its tall, Gothic structure casting long shadows. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, the heavy door creaking as it closed behind her. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way down the long, dimly lit hallway. She set up her camera and began her exploration, documenting every room and corridor she passed. As night fell, the building grew colder, and the shadows seemed to come alive. Lisa heard faint noises, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional creak of old wood. She tried to stay calm, reminding herself that it was just an old, abandoned building. Around midnight, she reached the security office. The monitors were still there, flickering with static. Lisa sat down at the desk and turned on her voice recorder. "Okay, it's midnight," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm in the security office. So far, I've seen nothing unusual, but the atmosphere is definitely creepy." She decided to review the footage she had taken so far. As she watched the playback, she noticed something strange. In one of the hallways, a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of the frame, standing still for a moment before disappearing. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. She rewound the footage and watched it again. The figure was definitely there, and it looked like a man in a security uniform. "Jake," she whispered to herself. The stories of the missing security guard came flooding back. She had read about Jake Larson and his mysterious disappearance, but seeing the shadowy figure on the footage made it all too real. Determined to find out more, Lisa headed to the basement. The air grew colder as she descended the creaky stairs. She could hear her own heartbeat loud in the silence. She reached the basement and walked down the narrow hallway, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The door to the old operating room stood ajar, just as it had in the stories. Lisa pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as described: rusted surgical tools, stained walls, and the skeletal remains on the table. Her flashlight beam landed on the silver locket around the skeleton's neck. She felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, and the whispering began. "Help me." Lisa turned, shining her flashlight around the room. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm and screamed, dropping her flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows. "Help me. Please." Lisa's heart raced. She grabbed her flashlight and backed away, her eyes wide with fear. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The whispering grew louder, filling the room. She pulled out her voice recorder and held it up, hoping to capture the sounds. "This is Lisa Thompson," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm in the basement of Whispering Pines Asylum. There are whispers, cold spots, and something touched me." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the whispering stopped. Lisa felt a presence behind her and turned slowly. Standing there was the ghostly figure of a young woman, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in a silent scream. "Emily?" Lisa whispered. The ghostly figure stepped closer, reaching out a hand. Lisa felt a cold grip on her arm and tried to pull away, but she couldn't move. "Help me, please." Lisa's vision blurred and she felt herself being pulled into darkness. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was Emily's face, her eyes filled with despair. When Lisa didn't return, her colleagues grew worried. They contacted the authorities, and a search was conducted. They found her camera and voice recorder in the basement, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. The footage showed her final moments, the ghostly figure of Emily, and then the camera falling to the floor. Lisa's disappearance only added to the legend of Whispering Pines. The asylum remained abandoned, a place of darkness and despair. People continued to tell stories of the haunted building, and some swore they could still hear the faint whispers of a young woman begging for help. The asylum stood as a reminder of the horrors that had taken place within its walls and the spirits that were forever trapped inside. And every now and then, a new seeker of truth would venture into the building, only to vanish into the darkness, their whispers joining those of Emily and Jake, forever echoing through the haunted halls.